Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Okay. Well, it's very difficult to sit here and hear so many positive things about myself, I'm afraid. But I appreciate that, and I appreciate the depth of the comments as well, and the care that you've taken in making them, and the fact of the award, and all the trouble that you put into making this event occur, and making sure that I was part of it. And I also appreciate the fact that we could arrange this virtually, although it would have been better for all of us had I been there in person. I guess I should make some remarks as a consequence of that intense introduction. And how long would you like me to speak? How long would that be appropriate?
Well, if you can do 15 minutes, that'd be great. But
yes. Well, I don't know if I've ever only spoken for 15 minutes.
No,
but
we'd love you to speak more. Please go ahead. We are here.
Okay. Well, I guess I might start with some comments. I'll start with some comments about what was brought up in the introduction. I'll start, I think, first of all, with a discussion about the state of my political belief, let's say. If it is a political belief, I think it's more a metaphysical belief, but it has political implications. So I've been thinking through the dichotomy between liberal and conservative, partly on the temperamental front, because I understand that there are different inbuilt temperamental predispositions that tilt us towards a more conservative or more liberal stance. And I would say temperamentally, in some ways, I'm more on the liberal end of the distribution because I'm high in trait known as openness, which is a creativity dimension. And creative people like untrammeled information flow and tend to think quite disparately and in a more visionary manner. The price that you pay for that is false positives. Creative people can be in error radically with their perceptions of patterns and their determination of potential future paths. And so as you're more expansive in your thinking, the probability that you might be radically right increases, correct, but the probability that you'll be radically wrong also increases. And so that's the cost. I am also a rather conscientious person, orderly and industrious, and that's a more conservative trait. And so I straddle the uncomfortable divide between the two patterns of belief. But then I would say, philosophically, I've probably become more explicitly conservative in later years. And that's complex, partly because my belief that I was fundamentally liberal in my thought was allied with the notion that I believe that the individual is the proper level of analysis, politically and philosophically, theologically, ethically, all of that. I believe, along with Kierkegaard, let's say, that redemption is a matter of individual striving. And I am a psychologist, say, rather than a sociologist or a political scientist or an economist. And so even in my choice of profession, when push came to shove, I focused on the individual rather than on the group. But I have come to understand in recent years more explicitly, I would say, particularly under the influence of psychologists such as Jean Piaget, perhaps more than any others, but also more biologically oriented thinkers such as Frans de Waal and Jaak Panksepp, that there's a liberal and Protestant strain of psychological thinking that's actually predicated on somewhat of a misapprehension. And I think it expresses itself to some degree in our current culture-wide confusion about the nature of identity. And so if you read the humanists of the 1960s, like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers to some degree, although I think Maslow was more guilty of this than Rogers, you would get the impression, and you get this in some sense from the psychoanalysts as well, that sanity is a matter of individual self-actualization and expression. And it's best conceptualized as something that's fundamentally personal in nature. And so you could be, if you're optimally functioning on a psychological level, it means that you've actualized something that's intrinsic to you as a subjective being. And so even for Freud, who wasn't a 1960s humanist, let's say, sanity is something like the proper internal balance of three internal forces: ego, superego, and id. And even for Jung, who is a broader thinker than Freud and a deeper thinker, sanity is still something like the harmonious interplay of intrapsychic forces. And you certainly see that with the existential or the humanist psychologists of the 1960s. So psychological health is construed as something that manifests itself most particularly at the level of the individual. And I would say, in some ways, I believed that, and that probably shaped my choice of psychology as the science and practice of choice for me. But I've come to understand more explicitly, more recently, that perspective is lacking. And it's lacking in some ways the same way that the notion that the free market can exist independently as a moral agent outside an underlying metaphysical and ethical substrate, because I don't think it can. That's apropos to comments that were made in the introduction. The proper operation of the free market, and the free society for that matter, presupposes an underlying ethos that's more fundamental than either the free individual or the free market. And then the question starts to become, well, what is that underlying ethos? And I think that a number of disciplinary lines of investigation are converging on a very similar answer. And the answer has something to do with the inevitable emergence of a ethos of social responsibility as a consequence of the necessity of maintaining progressing, iterative social interactions. So imagine that, and this is also a failure of classic economics and its theories of man. So classic economists presume that human beings are self-interested actors. And they also implicitly define self-interested in a narrow manner that's predicated on the assumption of a certain kind of hedonism, a narrow hedonism. And so we maximize our self-interest. But the question is, well, what exactly is self-interest? And that's where things move from the liberal domain, I would say, in some fundamental way, to the conservative domain. So there's a self that you could bind in a moment. And I would say that's the self that would be after immediate hedonic gratification. And you see that manifest itself most particularly, let's say, in the case of addictive behaviors, where the motivational impetus is to maximize positive emotion and reduce negative emotion, but in the moment. And so people are tempted towards the use, let's say, of amphetamine-like substances like cocaine and obviously amphetamines that do increase positive emotion, or tempted towards use of sedative agents that decrease negative emotion. And speaking only as an advocate of hedonistic self-interest, you might say, well, why not? And the answer is, well, you pay for it later. And so what that means in some sense is that we need a more expanded version of what constitutes self-interest than the narrow self-interest of the moment. Because if you're acting properly in relationship to yourself, you act in a manner that works now, that doesn't compromise you in an hour or in a day or in a week or in a year, or maybe in 10 years, or maybe in 40 years, or maybe even throughout the life of your children. And because human beings are self-conscious and aware of the future, we do have a proclivity to take the self that's iterated across time into account when we're making what would otherwise be momentary and impulsive hedonic decisions. We know that people gripped by positive emotion, for example, are much more likely to be impulsive. And so that's the danger of happiness, and like the technical danger of happiness and positive emotion. And I do think that the voice of conscientiousness is in large part the sense of the violation of the iterated versions of the future selves that unfold across time. And what that means on the conservative side is that even when we're acting in terms of our individual self-interest, if we're doing that in a mature manner, then we have to treat our personal selves as a community of variegated individuals, different individuals that we will become, in some sense, a say in what we're doing right now. And so the answer there is, well, don't do something today for which you're going to pay for direly tomorrow. And then we might also extend that, and I think this is directly analogous to the fact that, well, and this bears directly on issues of identity, but we'll go there later. I want to take myself into account, but then I'm married. And so then the question immediately emerges, just exactly how much of myself is my wife? And the answer is, well, if it's a true marriage, then a lot. At minimum, even phenomenologically, the quality of my interactions with her are going to make up a lot of the experiences that I deem as my experience. And so it's very difficult to say in what way she isn't me. And I can certainly say that if you want to have a good marriage, you better bloody well treat your wife as if she's an extension of you, and an autonomous and equally valuable extension. And I don't mean in some metaphorical sense. I mean in some practical, continually iterative sense, because it'll just be hell for both of you if that's not the case. And then the two of you, husband and wife, let's say, you're going to be embedded in a family, either with your mutual parents or with your children or both. And then a harmonious relationship between you as an individual and your wife, and you as a couple, and your family as a unit, that also has to be established. And I think you can think about that musically in some sense. If all of those elements at those different levels of hierarchical arrangement are organized properly, then there'll be a harmonious union that emerges out of that. And if you abide by that harmonious union, then you exist in some sense in a state of productive peace and grace. And then that family unit has to be nested inside the local community, and then inside the town, and then inside the state, and then inside the country, and then to some degree inside the international order, and then to some degree within the potentially fatal embrace of the natural world itself. And understanding that nested embeddedment of the individual in those superordinate categories gives you a theory of sanity that's something more like the harmonious function of every single one of those social interactions at every single level simultaneously. And that's a much better definition of sanity. And I also think that sanity in the absence of that nesting is actually not possible. I don't know anyone who can be sane, or certainly not maintain sanity, without the constant feedback about who they are and what they're doing from agents in some sense outside of themselves, nested at all of those levels of order simultaneously. And so I've thought for a while too that one of the things that parents do for children is help them become socially acceptable enough so that their peers will accept them as playmates. We know perfectly well that that's a cardinal goal of early socialization. You want to make your children maximally socially acceptable, desirable, let's say, by the age of 4. And if you fail, the consequences are exceptionally dire for your child and irremediable by all known techniques. That's the clinical situation. And part of the reason you want to make your child socially desirable is because if your child is in constant interaction with the others that surround him or her in this hierarchical manner, they can outsource the problem of maintaining sanity and psychological integration to the world. Imagine that you have some character flaws, which shouldn't be that difficult to imagine. And then imagine that you're with friends, and they're real friends. And then imagine that you tell a joke, and the joke falls flat for reasons of delivery or lack of taste. And then imagine that your friends give you a bit of a rough time about that. And that's a reminder from them that you've transgressed a social boundary. And people are sending messages of transgression and and abiding by the appropriate or desirable social norms. They're sending messages about that to each other all the time. if with every word, with every facial gesture, with every nonverbal interaction, you're being reminded by the people you're fortunate enough to be associated with how you would conduct yourself if you were an optimally admirable individual. And that it's paying attention to those signals that basically constitute sanity itself, as far as I can tell, rather than it being merely the consequence of an optimally arranged pattern of intrapsychic sub-entities, let's say, or being a consequence of something like mere humanistic self-actualization in the face of external superego and tyranny. And so understanding that, and I think that's an indisputable truth, because the biologists who are studying the construction of animal hierarchies have come to exactly the same conclusion. I think it's an undeniable truth. That's tilted me in a more explicitly conservative direction, because if sanity itself is a consequence of the optimization of functional embeddedness within a traditionally defined hierarchy, then sanity itself is dependent on the maintenance of something like conservative tradition. And now that doesn't exhaust sanity in some sense, right? Because first of all, the social order can become warped and tyrannical, and now and then you have to take a stand against it. And we should also point out that there is great utility in transformative creative endeavor, but even making those allowances, which are crucially important, doesn't eradicate the fact that the fundamental foundation of proper psychological integration looks highly social and is dependent on the proper hierarchical arrangement and the proper complex function of social arrangements at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. So that's definitely tilted me more towards a explicit conservative philosophy. No sanity without proper social function. It doesn't look like it's even possible. Partly, I would say, too, because it's too complex to regulate yourself, right? You don't have exhaustive self-knowledge. You're too complex to know yourself thoroughly. And so you have to outsource the problem of maintaining the delicate balance of your own complexity to multiple social actors and bring many, many different brains to bear on the problem. And so this is partly why teenagers are obsessed with fitting in. You know, their job, when they're young, they're dependent and they can rely on their parents to intermediate between them and the social world. When they start to escape that, they're not yet capable of being the more autonomous individuals they will be as full adults. And what they do is outsource the problem of who they should be and how they should act to their peer group. And, you know, that produces some of the pathologies of teenagehood. You say, well, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump off too? And the answer that most teenagers would give, if they were honest, is, yeah, I jump off the bridge right away, because my friends would torture me to death if I was too cowardly to do so. And the proper parent would likely say, well, I can understand why you would do that, because your fundamental goal is, in fact, to shape yourself into someone who can play by the rules of your peer group. But you have to remember that there's something beyond that as well. And that would be that contribution of individual creativity and integrity back to the group that we discussed earlier. And so I think that's what situates me more comprehensively and more explicitly on the conservative front. And then I would say there's one other element too that's probably relevant, and that has to do with a deep understanding that I've developed, at least deep for me, on behalf of the role that religious traditions play. And so I'm going to walk through that very briefly, and then maybe I'll bring these remarks to a halt. So I have come to understand more comprehensively since I wrote Maps of Meaning that not only do we view the world through the lens of a story, but that is inevitable, that there is no other way of viewing the world except through the lens of a story. And then I would say further that what we call a story is actually the verbal description of a lens through which the world may be viewed. And the reason that we value stories and the reason that they're attractive to us is because knowing how to look at the world is so valuable that we have an instinct that directs us towards being gripped by any representation of such a lens. And then this has to do with the issue of whether the world is a forum for action or a place of things. And I would say we even see the place of things through a description of the forum for action. And so value is actually prior to perception. And I also think the cognitive science, the most advanced cognitive science, points in that direction. And also it points in that direction unhesitatingly. Because an emergent problem has developed. Partly it drove postmodernism. The emergent problem is that any set of potential perceptual phenomena is so complex that it looks irreducible. And so whenever you look at the world, and I mean at any given visual scene or auditory scene for that matter, you're faced with the problem of an almost infinite multiplicity of possibility. And so the question is, well, how do you focus your attention? And that is really the question, because without focusing your attention, you cannot see the world. You can't even get to the empirical phenomena. And the answer is, well, you perceive the world through a hierarchy of attentional prioritization, which means that you look at one thing and not all the other things you could look at. And then you might say, well, what do you look at? And the answer is, you look at the thing that you calculate to be the most important thing that you should look at that moment. And most important means most valuable. And then you might say, well, how do you make that determination? And that brings us back to the investigation of a hierarchy again. You know, you might say, well, why are we all gathered together in this room? And the answer is, well, because we're involved in an award ceremony. And why are we giving an award? Well, because we want to signify the existence of a certain pattern of action. And we might say, well, why do we want to signify that pattern of action? We might say, well, we found it admirable. And then we might say, well, why did we find it admirable? And we could say, well, it partakes of the class of admirable actions. And then we could say, well, what is that class? We could say, well, it's part of the encounter between what is known and what is unknown, the courageous investigation of the frontier. And then we might say, well, why would we bother with that? And the answer is, well, that's how we establish and update our knowledge. And we do that because we want to live in the most fundamental and productive possible manner. And then we can say, well, that's all encapsulated inside something like the notion of the logos. And that's quite the damn story. And that is the fundamental story. And I've become almost completely convinced now that not only is that the fundamental story, but it has to be the fundamental story. And that the religious stories that undergird our culture are in some sense so true that they constitute the fundamental precondition for truth itself. I'm writing a book now called We Who Wrestle with God. And and you might say, well, what's the fundamental reality? You might question, what's the fundamental reality? Because you could say, well, it's a description of things and not a map for action and perception. But I don't think that's true, because a description of things cannot tell you how to act. That's the famous is-ought problem. And that's partly because you can derive a very large number of potential pathways from any description of a given situation. So you can't follow the science, because the science does not give you a direction. It gives you some hints as to what a potential useful direction might be, assuming certain values, but there's no unerring guide from the description to the action. And so then the question is, well, what's the unerring guide to action? And I would say that's fundamentally derived from tradition. And one of the things I've started to understand about the biblical corpus is that it's a sequence of characterizations of the nature of the spirit that unites us psychologically as individuals, but also socially as communities. And so I'll just walk you through a bit of that, give you a flavor of it. So for example, God in the opening chapters, opening sentences of verses of Genesis is presented as the source of order that uses something like the logos to extract order out of possibility. And then that's a model for the image in which men and women are made. And I think that's exactly right, because I think we are creatures who confront the horizon of possibility and transform it into order. And I think we can do that ethically, in which case the order we extract is good, or we can do it unethically, in which case the order we construct is bad. And I see that as a fundamental truth. We're creatures who wrestle with the indeterminate horizon of possibility that constitutes the future. We are not deterministic machines. In fact, first of all, we can't be, because the universe is not deterministic. And because the universe is not deterministic, the horizon of the future is unpredictable, and no algorithm can compute it. And so we're not automaton robots, period. And the science says that, I would say, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And so that's the first characterization of the divine spirit that should be imitated. And the next characterization, or a later characterization, is God is the spirit that you walk with if you walk unself-consciously in the garden. And that happens after Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and are banished from the garden. God asks Adam to walk with him, and Adam won't. And Adam won't walk with God because he's self-conscious. That's basically what he says, that Eve has given him a fruit that's made him aware of his own nakedness, and now he can no longer walk with God. And so you say, well, what does that mean? It's, well, you know what it's like if you're doing something worthwhile in a beautiful and relatively secure and safe place, and you're not self-conscious, is that you're imbued with a spirit of engrossment in the nature of being. And that might be momentary and transitory, but you certainly enjoy it, and you certainly regard it as a pinnacle experience. And you might do everything you can to make that experience happen over and over if you have enough courage. And then in the story of Cain and Abel, God is the spirit that calls us to proper sacrifice and holds us accountable if we fail in that task. And I think that's more or less self-evident that's a high-level spirit that does that, and it's also something that's independent of us, because this is something that Dostoevsky explored famously in Crime and Punishment, is you can break the moral code. And this is where Nietzsche was wrong. You can break the moral code, but you will hold yourself accountable, or more to the point, something within you that's outside of you and transcendent will absolutely hold you to account. And I think that's an undeniable fact of human experience. And we don't know what that spirit is, but we certainly know that it exerts a great influence on us. And then in the story of Noah, God is construed as the spirit that calls the wise and just to prepare in the face of intuited catastrophe. And is that not a spirit you would follow? Is that not a spirit you would believe in? I mean, and is that not a spirit whose possession of someone else would cause you to, at least in some probability, admire that person? I think the answer to all that is yes. If you know someone wise and just who's becoming concerned about an impending disaster and who is taking steps to forestall it, then the probability that you will imitate that person is very high. And that's the imitation of this abstracted divine spirit. And in the story of Abraham, God is the spirit that calls human beings out of their safe household, let's say, safe nation for that matter, safe complacency, into the world of adventure. And Abraham has quite an adventure. It's certainly not the simple pursuit of happiness or security in any sense of the word. And then I'll give you two more examples and then close this part of it. So there's another later, a bunch of stories, but later in part of the narrative of Exodus, it's actually in Numbers, but the Israelites are wandering through the desert. And what does that mean? Well, imagine you're in a tyranny, and we're all in a tyranny to some degree. Sometimes it's the prison of our own imagination. And you might say, well, what stops us from breaking the bounds of tyranny? Because why subject yourself to tyranny? And the answer might be, well, if you drop your sterile presuppositions, you don't go to the promised land, you go to the desert. So that too explicit certainty, when disrupted, doesn't produce redemption, it produces radical doubt. And so you end up somewhere outside the tyranny that's just as bad as the tyranny, but it's a mirror image, and that would be the desert. And so that's what happens to the Israelites. And they're wandering around in the desert, and they're getting pretty desperate because it's been a long time. and they don't know which way's up and they don't know which way's down, and they lose faith. And so God is not very happy that they lose faith, and he sends in a bunch of poisonous snakes to bite them, which seems a little harsh on God's side, but he seems to have a thing for disruptive snakes, and so he does it anyways. And they're biting the Israelites to the point of destruction and distraction. And so the Israelites all get together and they decide that they should probably return their allegiance to God. And they go see Moses and they say, could you have a chat with God since you seem so close with him? And maybe you could get him to call off the damn snakes. And so Moses speaks to God. And then the story takes a very weird twist, because it would even make sense as a story if God softened his heart and repented and got rid of the snakes, which he produced. But that isn't what happens. He tells Moses to cast a serpent in bronze and to erect it on a staff and to place the serpent on the staff in the ground. It's an echo of the serpent and the tree of life. In any case, or it's an echo of the staff of Moses that transforms into a serpent, because that's part of what happens during the plague. In any case, you put down the staff of bronze with the serpent on it, and then you get the Israelites. He says, bring the Israelites over and have them look at the snake, gaze upon the snake. And if they do that, well, the snakes will still be there, but if they bite them, they won't die. And that's a very weird story, because the simple thing to happen from a narrative perspective is that God just chases away the snakes. And the fact that he gets the Israelites to go look at these wrong snakes that's very mysterious. But I know the key to it, at least in part. One of the things clinical psychologists have learned in the last 100 years across the fields of clinical psychology, all the different subdisciplines, is that if you expose people voluntarily to the things that hurt and frighten them, they get braver. They don't get less anxious. They get braver. And that generalizes. So if you expose someone, for example, who's terrified of elevators, who has agoraphobia, and they learn to re-inhabit the elevator, it's often women, they'll often go have a fight with their husband. And they might have been afraid to do that for 20 years, but they get braver because they've confronted the catastrophe of potential humiliating death inside the elevator. They find out they can tolerate it, and then they have a much more courageous orientation towards life. And that's a fundamental clinical dictum. Exposure to that which frightens you into avoidance, if it's voluntary, is curative. And that's the key issue in that story of Moses. And that's really something. That's a near literary miracle. But there's something on top. So that's another aspect of God. God might be he who sends the snakes, but God is also the spirit that will inhabit you if you courageously confront the snakes that assault you. And that's something to know. And then you get a transformation of that in the Gospels, because Christ assimilates himself to the serpent on the stake. And he says something like, unless I'm lifted up like the serpent in the desert, and unless you lift me up like the serpent in the desert was lifted up, there will be no entry into the kingdom of heaven. It's something like that. And that's a very weird thing for anyone to say, especially given that the references to a story that's almost completely opaque, that was written maybe at least 2,500 years before. And so that really begs an explanation, right? That's either something random and inexplicable and bordering on insanity, or it means something so damn deep it's almost impossible to penetrate. And it's the latter that's true. And I think I figured out, at least in part, why. And so imagine that it is the case that voluntary exposure to that which petrifies you is curative. And I think, as I said, the evidence for that, that's actually the mechanism of learning itself, right? Because when you encourage children to push themselves beyond their current horizon, they do have to encounter something they're made timid by and overcome it. And that process of adaptive overcoming is the process of learning. So the fact that voluntary exposure to the frightening and unknown is curative is actually a definition of the process of adaptation itself. And then you might say, well, how radical does that have to be in order to be optimally successful? And I would say that's what Christianity has been attempting to explicate for 2,000 years. And so the notion would be, if you think about the Passion story is in some sense the sum of all possible snakes, because it involves Carl Jung described the Passion story as an archetypal tragedy, the archetypal tragedy. And the reason it was archetypal in some sense is because it represented a limit case. It may be possible to formulate equally tragic stories, but it's not possible to formulate one that's more tragic. So it's the essence of tragedy itself. And you might ask why, and I can give you a few hints as to that. Well, first, the core of tragedy is undeserved suffering, let's say. And then what you have to do to make it archetypal is you have to magnify the undeserved and you have to magnify the tragedy. And so that's easy. First of all, you make the person who's submitted to the tragedy not only innocent in all possible ways, but as good as anyone has ever been. And then you make sure everyone knows that, because there's no misapprehension as to that goodness. And then you make the death early, and then you make it brutal in the most brutal possible way. And then you make it brought about by tyrants as a consequence of betrayal, pushed forward by someone who is relativistic in relationship to the truth at the hands of a mob that knew that the innocence was real and that chose a criminal instead to be redeemed. It's like, that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. That's kind of the sum total of all the horrors of life. But then that's not all, because in the cloud of mythology that surrounds Christianity, there's a notion that the figure of divinity that Christ represents is not only the voluntary confrontation and acceptance with the worst that individual life can possibly throw at you, but also the encounter with hell itself, because Christ harrows hell. And we talked a little bit earlier in the intro about totalitarian atrocity. And, Nazi death camp or a Gulag archipelago camp is pretty much a close enough analog to hell for me, as something that would demonstrate the reality of something like hell, which is an evil that's so deep that it's transcendent in some real sense. And that's really what the Nuremberg judgments decided, as we all know. And I would say that to face the totality of life does not only mean to face the reality of unjust suffering and the sacrifice of the innocent, but to encounter the very forces of hell themselves. And that is the pathway to redemption. And that's a hell of a story. And I think, as far as I can tell, and I don't know what this means in the final analysis, and neither does anyone else. As far as I can tell, it's just true. And I could close by saying, let's think it through for a minute. Like, imagine that you were going to maximally adapt to life. Well, how could you get away with avoiding any of it? Like, you have to go everywhere in some sense, and you have to do everything in some sense, and you have to accept everything about life, because otherwise you're hiding away, right? You're not calling on yourself even to be forced to reveal what is within you that would allow you to prevail. And so that would mean, in some sense, that Christ is, speaking psychologically, the proper model for emulation, because the proper model for emulation is the radical acceptance of the suffering that characterizes life and the hellish aspect that's a consequence of, well, human insufficiency and sin. And that's on each of us. And I think that is the central Christian doctrine. And I also think that's the foundation stone of Western civilization. And so I suppose all of that also makes me a very strange sort of conservative, but still a conservative. And so, yeah, I'm detailing all of that and more, I would say, in my next book, by the way. And that's what I've been working on now. And so that's probably not such a bad place to stop, because that's a lot of information in a very short period of time. So I would like again to thank all of you in the deepest sense, and again to express my regrets for not being able to be there in person. I'm zipping about in many places in a very short period of time, and I'm glad we were able to do this, and I'm glad that it worked. And I appreciate, as I said, all the time and effort and the recognition, let's say, that this represents. And that's a good place to bring these remarks to a close.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you very much. And all best and good luck, and may you continue with your work. We need you.
Well, I hope perhaps we can meet when I'm in the UK, and I'll be in the UK for about a month right away. I think I land there next week, and so we can make arrangements to conclude this properly in some manner in person, and that would be very good. So thank you all for the signal honor. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, we're offline.